Rebels in northern Ethiopia's Tigray region take more territory, including the capital. But the federal government denies it's losing the battle. Those displaced now face the risk of famine. So, is this the end or the beginning of a wider conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The fight for Ethiopia's Tigray region saw a sudden turn this week, with rebel forces taking back the provincial capital Mekelle while the central government declared a ceasefire. Fighting in the area had intensified in recent weeks. People celebrated as Ethiopian and their allied Eritrean forces withdrew. But the Tigray People's Liberation Front has rejected the ceasefire as a joke, saying it'll keep pushing to recapture the entire region. Ethiopia's government denies it's on the back foot. An army spokesman insists soldiers can retake Mekelle in 3 weeks if they wanted. He says troops were pulled out to deal with an external threat to Ethiopia. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Catherine Soy in neighboring Kenya.
The Ethiopian government has issued a statement about what's going on in Tigray, and one of the things that stands out is the reasons given for the withdrawal of the national army from some areas in that region. The statement says that the reason is that the soldiers need to prepare for a more national external threat. Did not say what threat this is or which these external forces are, but then the statement did say that the Tigrayan defense forces that appear to be on the offensive now are not a priority to deal with, and that if need be, the army, the military, can take over the capital Mekelle within 3 weeks. So the government saying that the withdrawal is a strategic move, and also saying that the declaration of the ceasefire was also a political move because of humanitarian reasons. It says that farmers need to go back to their farms to plant to avert a famine. Now, we also talked to the spokesman of TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, Getachew, who says that the Tigrayan fighters, will not rest until every inch of Tigray is liberated. He says, however, that TPLF is in principle happy to hold any kind of talks to de-escalate the situation, talks with the government, but with conditions. He says that all services, including telecommunications and internet services and so on, must resume. That has been cut off. He says that there has to be accountability of the atrocities that have been committed against Tigrayan people, and all, he calls them invading forces, all invading forces must leave Tigray. So it's going to be interesting in the coming days and coming weeks to see whether this ceasefire will hold. Already the Tigrayan forces have said that it's a joke, and to see how the government, the Eritrean government, and the Amhara forces, which still control huge chunks of western Tigray, how all these forces, all these bodies are going to respond.
The fighting has displaced more than 2 million people since November. Rights groups have accused all sides of mass killings and rape. 350,000 people now face famine, and at least 60,000 have escaped across the border to Sudan. The U.S., a major ally, says it'll take further measures against Ethiopia and Eritrea if the situation doesn't improve soon.
It is essential now that all parties commit to the ceasefire, allow humanitarian access, protect civilians, there be independent investigations into atrocities, and that there is justice for victims. Ethiopia is at a pivot point. It's at an inflection point. What the parties do now matters and will determine whether there is a better future ahead for Ethiopia.
What we are seeing unfold in Tigray bears the hallmarks of crimes against humanity, and quite possibly a genocide. Prospects for a durable peace in Ethiopia and its role as a responsible regional leader are now in question, as is Prime Minister Abe's legacy.
Relations between Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Tigray's leaders worsened after he introduced reforms in 2018, which included dismantling the federal governing coalition, which was led by TPLF officials from Tigray. The TPLF, which had dominated Ethiopian politics for decades, accused Abiy of trying to increase federal power. Abiy postponed last year's elections, citing coronavirus concerns, but regional leaders in Tigray held their own vote in September in defiance of the central government. Then in November, the government said TPLF rebels attacked a federal army base in the north and killed soldiers. It sent troops in response. Ethiopia's government took control of Mekelle in late November and declared victory, but the fighting continued and worsened in recent weeks. All right, let's bring in our guests. In Addis Ababa, Samuel Getachew, a journalist based in Ethiopia. In Rome, Laetitia Bader, Horn of Africa Director at Human Rights Watch. And in The Hague, Adem Kassie Abebe, Program Officer at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. A warm welcome to you all. Samuel, let me start with you today. Tigrayan rebels, they have rejected the government's unilateral ceasefire. They have described it as a joke. So where does that leave the overall situation right now?
It seems the fighting will continue. There will be lots of people that will be impacted by this. I speak from the humanitarian perspective. The people that I met, they have no connection to the politics of Addis Ababa or Mekelle or TPLF or the Ethiopian government. So the focus from the beginning, as reflected by the UN and other organizations, has been the impact it's been having on the ground. Many countries, friendly countries to Ethiopia, including the Biden administration, has been calling for some kind of ceasefire. We're hoping we're going to see this ceasefire have an impact on the ground. But it seems this conflict will go on, and again, many people will be impacted. And aid organizations continue to ask for some kind of humanitarian corridor that might not be achieved. But at the end, it's everyday people that will be impacted by any decision that comes from either the Abiy administration or the TPLF government that is in Mekelle at the moment.
Laetitia, Samuel there was talking about the humanitarian crisis that's been playing out in the Tigray region. Now, according to the UN, hundreds of thousands of people in Tigray are facing famine. This is a conflict that has been characterized over and over again by abuses of civilians. There have been widespread reports of massacres, sexual violence, burning of crops, and much, much more. How devastating has this conflict been from a humanitarian standpoint?
I mean, enormous in terms of the level of atrocities which have been committed, which have in many ways directly resulted in the humanitarian crisis we're talking about right now. And that is both because of the actions of warring parties, in terms of the destruction of civilian infrastructure, in terms of the destructions of crops, harvest, burning of harvest, but also the very basis of survival for civilians on the ground. And at the same time, a lot of the actions of the warring parties have also contributed on restrictions on movement of civilians. So when we're talking about humanitarian access right now, we need to talk about both ensuring that there is unimpeded access for humanitarian actors, but also making sure that all warring parties are not targeting civilians in need who need to reach assistance immediately. I mean, I think this is where it's important to underline that the warning signs which were coming out in early June around the fact that there were already a third of a million people who were already starving, the clear message there was that if immediate urgent assistance wasn't given then, we were going to be dealing with an even bigger humanitarian crisis.
Adem, you know, when news first emerged that Mekelle had been retaken by Tigrayan rebels, many analysts described this as a stunning turn of events for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Just how big of a setback is this for him?
It is a setback. At the same time, I think they have realized that this is a war that is unwinnable. And it's not really because they lost the war that they are living. I think it's really a grinding stalemate that we have seen. And it seems like the movement of troops, both on the Eritrean and Ethiopian side, was pre-planned and coordinated. So it's not really a defeat that led to the return of the TPLF and the Tigray Defense Force back to Mekelle. It's a realization on the side of the federal forces that this is an unwinnable war.
Samuel, the TPLF lost territory not just to Ethiopian government forces, but also to Eritrean soldiers and to fighters from the Amhara region. So how much territory in all did they lose?
Again, like everything in Ethiopia, we get all kinds of allegations and facts and numbers, and we can never verify what's been happening unless we have access to this, some of the areas that you mentioned. I was able to travel to only some cities in Tigray, including Mekelle, Aksum, Adwa, and Adigrat, and Abe. But the rest of Tigray wasn't even accessible to us or aid organizations. So it's really, really difficult to verify what's been happening on the ground. There's no media that has been having such an access for them to make that determination. So it's speculation once again, but they did lose some. We just have to verify the information. And I have conflicting information. So, I don't know.
Laetitia, I've seen a lot of reports now that people are hopeful that aid will be able to eventually get in to Tigray region. But from your vantage point, what are the implications of what has happened? Do you believe that humanitarian agencies will be able to get unfettered access to Tigray region? And how soon do you expect that might happen?
Well, I think it's as Samuel just mentioned, we don't really know right now. There is a communication shutdown again in the region. And it's absolutely urgent, adamant that the Ethiopian government needs to ensure that the communications is restored. The electricity has been shut down again. This is both making it impossible for organizations like ours, for the media to report in real time, to understand. It's making it incredibly difficult for humanitarian actors to assess the situation on the ground. They need information to understand the security situation. But this is also critical for the communities on the ground. They need to know what's going on. They need to know where they can receive assistance right now. And so the communication shutdown is just terrible. And for that very reason, right now, it is urgent for the messaging which has been coming from the international community around unimpeded humanitarian access, around monitoring of assistance which is being distributed in the region in terms of ending restrictions on humanitarian actors, but also in terms of ending what has been the deliberate attacks on civilians in the way this war has been conducted. This is deliberately and directly contributed to the humanitarian crisis we're dealing with right now. So the messaging and the pressure needs to continue right now. It's absolutely urgent.
Adem, a spokesman for Tigrayan rebels said that they will stop at nothing to liberate every square inch of Tigray and that they will pursue the forces that they had been fighting against into Eritrea and into the Amhara region if need be. How much has the specter of a wider conflict grown as a result of all of this?
I'll get to that, but just to add into the issue of humanitarian access, I think the fact that the Ethiopian government federal force have now withdrawn, and also the fact that most of the humanitarian provisions were actually coming from Ethiopian sources, and now that the departure could actually worsen the gap in humanitarian provisions. So work has to be done to ensure that there is an increase in humanitarian provisions that will come from the gap that has been created. In terms of the communication blackout, I think we need to check whether the blackout is actually now because of infrastructure problems within the area that the Tigrayan force have controlled. If that is the case, I think it would have to be fixed there. But we also have to check whether the blackout is actually are the result of external measures from the federal government. So we need to see the exact reasons to be able to fix them. On the claim that the Tigrayan Defense Forces will pursue what they consider are enemy forces, I suspect that it is more a propaganda tool, and obviously they have a desire to continue on the momentum. But I am afraid that considering the depleted military capabilities that they have, and also considering that if they engage in an offensive, it will be more in a traditional war sense, which was very much like what happened in early November. And I'm not sure if they have the capabilities that they had at the time to actually defeat the federal and Amhara and other forces. So my sense is that they will stay where they are. And if they attempt to engage in an offensive, they may suffer severe casualties.
Samuel, where do things go diplomatically from here? I mean, do we expect to see, for example, African emissaries playing a role? Would the UN be more involved? What about the US? I mean, who could play the kind of role that is needed right now to de-escalate the situation?
For the most part, the African Union has been very powerless and has been mute when it comes to this kind of issues within the continent. They've been sending delegation, heads of state, former heads of state, and to speak to the leadership of Ethiopia. The EU has been coming back and forth, including the foreign minister of Finland, who may have misspoken, according to the Ethiopian side, by saying there is a genocide. But I think countries that are respected traditionally in terms of peace building are perhaps the Swedish, the Norwegians, even Canada. They have a brand that's respected. They have this gift of soft power they can use to try to bridge the gap. Because, again, within the African continent, because we see all this kind of disasters, we have this tendency to mention numbers. 91% of the population are facing food emergency, for example, or millions of people starving, or 500 people having, some kind of disaster. So when people begin to see the faces behind the number, as I have been, as some of us have been to the Tigray region, we begin to understand the impact this is having. I've never been to a society that is desperately in need of leadership and impacted by a conflict that has nothing to do with everyday people than the people I met in the Tigray region. Unless there is an international leadership that is respected by both, especially by the Ethiopian side, this conflict will continue, and it won't just be an Ethiopian matter. It will become a regional matter very soon. There are many Ethiopians that are heading to the Sudan. The Eritreans are involved from the northern countries, and these refugees will soon be heading to Europe. So this is becoming a worldwide international affair, and we should take it seriously.
Laetitia, I saw you nodding along to quite a lot of what Samuel was saying there. Did you want to jump in and add to the point he was making?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I do want to just come back to the discussion about the communications blackout as well. I mean, I think some of the arguments here we heard in the first few months that the communications were down, not because of actions by the federal government, but it does seem that the communications are down in most of Tigray right now. So it is difficult to see how the federal government would not be responsible for, or capable of shutting down the communications on such a broad scale. And I think we just underlining then again, we have seen repeated shutting off of communications when there have been periods of significant fighting and instability in the Tigray region. And each time when the communications have been restored, we have documented serious atrocities. So, again, why it is so important to keep the message about the need to restore communications immediately. In terms of the international community, I think we have repeatedly said that it is shocking that a conflict and a crisis of such magnitude and gravity is not on the agenda of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, has not been a standing item on the agenda of the Security Council in New York. It is essential for the Secretary General to use a range of powers that he has to publicly call for the international community to place Ethiopia on the agenda of the Security Council. Now is not the time to back down, as we were saying. And I mean, coming to the point Samuel was raising, I mean, here we're talking about a community, and it's very difficult to see right now sections of the Tigrayan civilian population that have been left unscathed by the abuses. And what is essential is that there needs to be independent investigators who are able to access throughout the region right now to ensure the preservation of evidence. This is a very big concern we've been raising since the beginning, to enable one day for there to be true accountability, and one which also the community is going to see as a credible form of accountability.
And Laetitia, if I could just follow up with you, when you talk about these rights abuses, these atrocities that you, your group and other rights groups have been documenting, it's all of the parties to the conflict who have been accused of committing these atrocities, correct?
I mean, we have definitely documented more abuses from the sides of the Ethiopian, Eritrean government forces and the Amhara regional forces. We have documented also significant abuses against the Eritrean refugee population, also by local Tigrayan militia forces in the early stages of the conflict. The Eritrean refugee population, which has in some ways been forgotten in more recent months, was targeted by all sides, including by the Eritrean forces, who destroyed the 2 Eritrean refugee camps in the Tigray region.
Adem, you know, when he took office 3 years ago, Prime Minister Abebe promised to unite Ethiopia. Is the country more fractured now than it was then? I ask this because it seems like it's been a huge fall from grace for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. I mean, he was a darling, especially of the West. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, and now there are some countries and humanitarian actors that essentially consider him to be a pariah. So, I mean, how does this impact him? And is the country more divided now after 3 years of his leadership than when he took the reins?
I don't think the country is more divided. I think we should not underestimate that the fissures, the divides in the country were inherited. We can argue, arguably, I think that the way he pursued the process of transforming the ruling party is at the root of the conflict that we see in Tigray, and also some of the tension in Oromia. But he is not the only actor that contributed to this particular problem. And I'm glad, I think you asked about the atrocities earlier committed by all actors. I think this is obviously, as a leader of a country, he is partly responsible for it. But to pin it only on him would be unhelpful to finding a more sustainable, a peaceful way of resolving the issue that we face today. So yes, his reputation has suffered, and it's understandable. Because all these things are happening under his watch. At the same time, we should recognize that these are complex disputes and everybody had a role. And I think the miscalculations that led to the war in November will not be repeated now. Particularly, I also hope that the Tigrayan Defense Forces will be more deliberate, more reflective of what has happened in these last 2-3 days, and take a more conciliatory approach rather than engaging in more offensive tactics that could ultimately be more damaging to a population that has already suffered a lot.
Samuel, did the Prime Minister, did Abiy Ahmed have any other viable options available to him at the moment other than declaring this unilateral ceasefire?
Well, he needed to. There was lots of pressure, for instance, from other international countries, including donors. USAID being, USAID has spent close to $500 million in the Tigray conflicts, trying to help all these victims. The surprise recapture of Mekelle might have played a role. But again, there is a worldwide understanding of what's happening in Ethiopia. it's in the open. There's social media. There are people, activists that have been debating this and talking about this for since last November. And I mean, I think it was time to listen and also listen to the victims on the ground. Even the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has been saying it, echoing what Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International has been saying from the get-go. I think there was lots of pressure, not just from donor nations, but from all of us, I guess, because the impact, the faces, they just have to be accounted for. There are too many of them.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Samuel Getachew, Laetitia Bader, and Adem Kassie Abebe. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this and all of our previous programs again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.